as we're getting started with this interview, I want to go back to when you were born, where you were born, that kind of thing. But also get some sort of flavor if there were siblings or a parent involved in the military, or what sort of led you to that direction, things that you kind of did leading up to that.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I'm originally from Morganton, North Carolina, which is about an hour's drive east of Asheville. It's a town actually very much like Culpeper, about the same size, and was about the same size as Culpeper at the time when I was growing up. At the same time, the same size that Culpeper would have been then, the same proximity to the Blue Ridge. So very similar sort of working class, agricultural, small town, kind of Appalachian foothills kind of town. My dad was a Navy veteran. He spent 4 years in the Navy during the Korean War. As a matter of fact, I have a brick in his honor down at Wine Street Park there in front of the monument. Other than that, I mean, I had some uncles who had been in the military and Navy, or neighbors who had been in the military. But I ended up joining the Army probably in a kind of unusual way because I was too young for Vietnam. Vietnam wrapped up when I was a junior in high school, so I didn't have to really face that. The draft, I had to register for selective service, but the draft really had stopped by the time I turned 18. And I was a bit of a young leftist, and so I was one of those I'll go to Canada first types.
Okay.
Yeah, but I was never faced with that decision, so I don't know why I would have done. But anyway, I was that type of kid. Graduated from high school, no real plan for life. Worked and lived at home for a year, then went to college, and took 5 years to get through a 4-year program. No urgency in graduating for me. I just sort of meandered around. And then I graduated from college in 1980 and sort of didn't really have a plan.
And what had you majored in school?
I majored in education, actually music education. So
okay. And you play?
I do, and
yes.
I still do. I did seriously back in those days. It's more of a hobby now. I sort of mess around with. But I spent 4 years after college really just knowing that I was capable of doing something, but not really being able to find my niche. And I applied.
And your dad wasn't necessarily pushing you into the military.
Oh no, I'm sure he would. I'm sure he thought I wouldn't have survived the first day of basic training. I am serious. My parents would never have thought I could have succeeded in that, in a million years. But I applied for teaching jobs around North Carolina, around the East. But in the early 80s, it wasn't a good time for arts education, and public schools funding was being cut and all that, recession in the early 80s. So anyway, by 84, I was still meandering around, and I knew I could do something. And I was always a smart, disciplined, focused kid, and I knew I was capable. But I had a friend from college, and I'll owe him this debt the rest of my life. He had graduated and been something else, and then he had joined the Army in '83, and he had gone in and was in the journalism field. And I ran into him after he'd been in for some months, and he was a squared away guy, smart, and he knew, he had everything figured out. It's kind of a guy who I admired, a little bit younger than me, but he had his stuff together. And I thought, you know what, if it worked out for him, maybe, just maybe, I ought to start thinking about this. And of course, I was casting about. So
and you had your degree, so
yeah,
if you had gone in,
degree.
you could.
So I had a college degree. Just I wasn't using it for anything, and I just wasn't. I was very frustrated because I was just going nowhere. Went back, lived with my parents for a while. Went back to Greensboro, North Carolina, which is where I went to school. Went back there for a while. So I went and talked to an Army recruiter, and I took the test, the aptitude test for the Armed Forces.
And I know probably what happened. I don't know for sure what happened, but I'm suspecting what happened.
Oh, I maxed that thing out. It's like, this guy said, this is the highest score I've ever seen. So, but I did prepare because I got the book and I studied and I went through, and anyway, I made sure I was ready for it. But with a 4-year college degree and doing well on the test, it opened up lots of opportunities for me. So I decided to join the Army. I talked to the Air Force, and there was really, that guy wasn't very interested. Apparently he'd made his quota for the month when I went in, but I went in and talked to the Army recruiter there in Greensboro. And he was quite interested. And so he signed me up to be a computer programmer, systems analyst, which was a newfangled thing at the time. This is '84. This is middle of '83. And so I figured, okay, computers are going to be a big deal. And so maybe I'll go in. I was going to enlist for 4 years, put some money back for college, get out, go back to school, get a computer science degree, and then start a whole new sort of career.
Okay, so a plan.
Yeah, so I had a plan at that point. So I went in the Army, and I ended up actually entering active duty in March of 1984.
March of 84.
Yeah, and when I told my parents, you could have knocked them over. They were just like, "Are you kidding me?"
And, and do you have siblings? I mean,
yeah, I have a sister who's a couple years younger than me. Who, I mean, she's never been in the military. So
now, okay, so then what happens after that?
Well, I went through training, Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic, Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, which is now closed for my my training in the computer stuff. Went to my first duty station at Fort Lewis, Washington. Oh, it was great. Oh, yeah, I spent a year there, and it was fabulous. It's near.
Well, I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, so the West Coast. Yeah.
So,
Beautiful.
and of course, when I went in the Army, I had been outside of North Carolina one time. And that was when I would drove with a friend of mine to Atlanta, which was like going to the far side of the moon for me. And I was, and I went in late. I was 27 when I enlisted, which was unusual. And when I turned up at basic training, and I'm 27, and everybody else is 18, 19, and 20, and I'm thinking, I have just made the most catastrophic decision of my life.
But you obviously were able to keep up with them.
So it worked out very well, and to be a little older actually was a benefit. Because I didn't get messed with as much by the drill instructors. I mean, basic training is a process of weeding people out, at least initially. They want to find out who's not going to be worth the expenditure and government resources. So when they figure people who might not be committed or in it for the wrong reasons, they'll start to harass people like that. That is, make them do lots of push-ups and stuff, and yell at them a lot. And trying to get rid of people like that. And if they figure out you're okay, then they start leaving you alone. And they left me alone very quickly. So I mean, I did fine through training and through the advanced training, and got to Fort Lewis, and it was a great duty assignment. I was there for just a few months, and the officer in charge of where I worked, it was a division data center for the 9th Infantry Division, since deactivated, but we worked in these big computer vans, like mid-1960s technology, and this was in the 80s, where all the programs were on punch cards and you fed them into a rig. I mean, it's just antiquated stuff. He had gone to officer candidate school about 10 years before, when he was a major at the time. And he started encouraging me to put it in the packet for OCS, because at the time at this point it's early '85, and this Reagan big military buildup, and they were looking for people, and I had a college degree and all this stuff, and so I was well sort of situated for that. And so this officer in charge and my other members of my chain of command encouraged me to put together an OCS packet, and I really wasn't terribly ambitious about it. I mean, I sort of just went along with it. Because again, I would have been out in '88 and I would have gone on another track and everything. But I put together the OCS packet and went to the board and got in. And then in August of '85, left Fort Lewis. Drove all the way back to North Carolina. Bought a car, drove back to North Carolina, which was a life-changing experience. Because again, I'd been to North Carolina, Georgia, and then Washington State. Had seen nothing else.
So for somebody who hadn't been out of the state and now you're driving across the country.
Yeah, it took 6 days. On my own, had a Honda Civic loaded down, and had never seen the Great Plains or the Rocky Mountains or any of that stuff. And I drove mainly on 2-lane roads in small towns, and I mapped out a route that would take me through towns or cities or national parks or historic sites that I'd always wanted to see. So it took me 6 days to make the trip.
Yeah, but that's all making connections with your educational path too.
Yeah.
So that all makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, but it was fabulous. I mean, again, it was sort of a life-altering experience. I mean, just to be out there by myself, seeing all this stuff that I'd never had read about but never seen before. I mean, it was a great time. So, went to officer candidate school in Fort Benning, Georgia, in September of '85. Went through that, got commissioned as an officer in December of '85. And my first duty station, well, I went to back to Fort Ben Harrison for training, then airborne school for 3 weeks, back to Fort Benning. Then my first duty station as an officer was Fort Irwin, California, 40 miles outside of Barstow in the desert, about 2 hours from Los Angeles. I spent 4 years there. There's
And what rank do you have then when you?
Second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant.
And so it was National Training Center, which even still today, like the Army's premier training center for its units. Now back then it was all Soviet-oriented stuff. This is late 80s, and so units would come out, armored mechanized infantry units would come out, and they would do like Soviet war games with tanks, American vehicles made up to look like Soviet tanks, and they would drive at each other across the desert and things. It was very interesting. So I spent 4 years there, which is where I met my wife, Felicia, as a matter of fact.
Oh, I wondered. Yeah.
Yeah, so we met there.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, we met there within a couple months after I arrived because we worked in the same building. She worked for the American Red Cross, and so the Red Cross office was in the same building where I worked initially. And I was on the installation staff, so for the first 3 years I had sort of office jobs there on the post, but it was great because I had normal office hours. And the Southern California desert was just I just loved it. I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, 40 miles from the nearest town. And so I could like take my little Civic and later the pickup truck that I still got that I bought out there. And I just drive down the road, see a dirt trail leading off into the hills, follow it and get out and just walk for 2 or 3 hours. And all you run into are like the remnants of an old mining operation and things like that. Never see another soul. And it was really nice. But at that point, it was like around 1990, and I'd made the decision at that point that there wasn't a reason to get out. I mean, once I became an officer,
you might as well just stay in.
Yeah, I mean, I had like a 3-year service commitment. I could have resigned my commission, I think, after 3 years. But there was no reason to there was nothing to get out for. There was nothing better for me on the outside than there was to be in, and so I just and plus one of my reasons for going in the military was to do a lot of traveling, which I'd never done. When I was a kid, we never went anywhere. And when I was a young guy, I never had the money to go anywhere, So I wanted to do some overseas assignments and go to Europe and those kinds of things before I got out. I left, so I was an adjutant general corps officer initially as an officer, who did deal with the admin things, and they also controlled all the computer stuff at the time. That's now different, but at the time I became an AG corps officer to sort of stay plugged into the computer field. But I met some other young officers who were in the Military Intelligence Corps, and so I applied to transfer into that branch, and then that was approved, and so then I became an MI officer, and that's what I was for the rest of my career. So I left Fort Irwin in 1990, and I went to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, to go through training to certify me as a military intelligence officer.
Okay.
So August 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait. And, nobody knows how long that's going to go. First there's Desert Shield, and then it's going to be Desert Storm after the first of the year. So we were scheduled to graduate at some point in the spring of 91, but toward the end of the year, 1990, our instructors said, look, if you're interested in volunteering to leave school early and then deploy to Saudi Arabia for Desert Shield, which is going to be a war at some point, put your name on this list. So I volunteered.
Now, were you and Felicia married at that time, or you were?
Not quite yet.
And the only reason I'm asking that is because I'm just wondering if you're now going to be where we're going with this.
Well, in fact, I'll answer that question in just a moment.
All right, okay.
Because it's coming up next. So anyway, early February of 91, I got a call, and it was one of the guys that ran our course, and he said, okay, you still want to go? I said, yeah. He says, okay, so you and these other guys who have agreed to go, you're going to, we'll run you through the course in a week, and you'll graduate in a week, and then you're going to go to Saudi Arabia, and you'll be an individual replacement. You'll be doled out to a unit already on the ground in Saudi Arabia. So at the time, Felicia was working at the Red Cross office. In fact, she was in charge of it at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada, about 500 miles from where I was. So I called her, and I said, because we'd been going together for like 5 years.
That's okay.
So I called her and I said, well, I'm going to be going to Saudi Arabia in about a week. So we need to make a decision what we're going to do here, because I have no idea how long I'll be gone. I might be gone 2 or 3 years, So anyway, we were sort of engaged, though we never really made a big deal of it.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you.
I think I had bought her a ring when we were still, she was living in Barstow and I was at Fort Irwin, but a couple years before, but we had never made a big deal of it, So we just figured, okay, I mean, if it works out, we'll get married maybe at some point. So anyway, I called and I said, look, I'll be gone in about a week. So if we think we're going to get married, we ought to just go ahead and do it. She came down within a couple of days and helped me pack the stuff up in my room. I lived in the bachelor officer's quarters, and I had some stuff. So she came down, and on Friday of that week, about 3 or 4 days after that, we went to the courthouse there in Sierra Vista, which is the county seat of Cochise County, and we paid a magistrate $15 to marry us. And then that was Friday, and then we had a honeymoon over the weekend, and then on Monday I shipped off. And
oh, wow. There wouldn't be any reason for me to know this about you two, but that's great.
Yeah, kind of a war bride situation, I suppose. So,
backtracking a little bit, and you'll probably get into this, but now that you've got this certification in this military intelligence, what kinds of responsibilities are involved with that? And I mean, you're going over to Saudi Arabia, but I'm just curious that we touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, with the initial work that I did as an officer, adjutant general course work, it was very administrative and to me bureaucratic, which is why I soured on it pretty quick. The MI Corps was all about analyzing the enemy, understanding the enemy. In this case, it was Saddam and the Iraqi army, and using what we know about the equipment that they had and the doctrine that they used to try to develop plans to then defeat them. And so when I went over to Saudi Arabia, I had put together all these reference manuals. And of course, the school there at Fort Huachuca gave us all this stuff, guide to the Iraqi military and all the specifics about the equipment that they used. And so we knew, all of us in our military intelligence group who went knew we would end up in an intelligence
capacity
where we would be participating in that sort of thing. So where I ended up actually was in Riyadh at the 3rd Army headquarters. You had CENTCOM, which was Schwarzkopf. He was the theater commander, if you recall Norman Schwarzkopf.
Sure.
Underneath CENTCOM and Schwarzkopf were service components. So you had an Air Force command and an Army command and the Navy and Marines. And so ARCENT, which is the 3rd U.S. Army CENTCOM, that was the Army component, which was the next level down from CENTCOM, and the ARCENT, the 3rd Army Commander, was in charge of all the Army forces on the command. And so I ended up in the 3rd Army Operations and Intelligence Center there in Riyadh, at a place called Escon Village, which was a compound on the outskirts of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And so what we did there was we, at a reasonably high level, coordinated support for sort of Army and theater level assets.
And were you fairly well protected in this facility, or?
Yeah, from where we were, the only risk was the occasional Scud. If you recall Scuds, and Saddam would shoot Scuds occasionally in Saudi Arabia. So the only risk that we had on the compound where we were, which actually was a joint U.S.-Saudi compound, so there were a lot of Saudis there as well, with reps from the other bit of the coalition. That was our main threat, and of course, hundreds of miles from the Iraqi border. So the Scuds were the only occasional threat that we had. So we didn't go around in full battle, as we called it, with weapons, and we carried a sidearm, but helmets and flak vests and things like that we didn't have to wear as a normal basis. Certainly after the war was over with. I mean, because we were in a fairly secure rear area. So I was there for 6 months.
So you were there for 6 months, and Felicia, of course, is still.
She stayed at Nellis. I was at in Riyadh for actually 3 months in Riyadh, and then once the war was over, and the mass redeployment of all of CENTCOM's people and resources started, myself and some other folks volunteered to remain, and we moved to Dhahran, up on the coast of Saudi Arabia, on the Arabian Gulf, and set up an ARCENT forward intel cell, because the main bulk was going back to Georgia, which is where 3rd Army was headquartered. So we sort of stayed as a forward element, and I stayed there for another 3 months. So I was in Saudi Arabia from February until the middle of August '91 for 6 months.
And what was life like there? I mean, you said it was in kind of a fairly protected facility, but what was your average day like?
Well, it was an intense environment, and certainly for me, because I was a fairly young guy. Well, young chronologically. I was
what, maybe 28, 29?
Well, I turned 35 over there actually. So, but I was inexperienced. I'd only been in the Army for what, 6, 7 years. I'd been an intel guy for maybe 3 of that. So I was still learning a lot of the particulars. And so, and of course, while the war was still going on, the ground war started while I was there. Of course, it was a fairly quick affair, like 4 days. But it's very tense, and you certainly don't want to screw anything up. And so we officially worked 12 hours in the operations center, but it would usually be more than that, 14, 15 hours by the time you'd actually go back, lay down a little bit, and then go back in the next morning. And it was a 7-day week thing. Limited time really to recuperate. Now, our existence was luxury compared to the units that were forward actually fighting in Iraq.
This is what I was wondering. And what was your contact, or was there much contact with those troops? I mean, they were there, but you said they weren't that close to where you were.
No, well, from where we were, we talked to the corps, to the corps level Army commands who were there. So if you go down the chain of command, so you have the Army, then you had the Corps, you had 7th Corps, 18th Airborne Corps. It's amazing how fuzzy some of this stuff gets over after the passage of time. But I know there were like 2 or 3 U.S. Corps there, and that's who we talked to. Within the Corps, then you had divisions. Divisions doing the bulk of the. I mean, the divisions and the brigades and the battalions down below. Those were the guys who were actually pulling the triggers and doing all that stuff. But I might point out.
I know. I was going to ask. I knew we were going to get to this.
This is my Desert Storm helmet, actually.
Okay.
Because when we went over. I guess the Army still does this, and maybe all their services, but they weigh you down with everything that you might potentially need in some possible circumstance. When I left the Army just 8 years ago, they were still issuing these World War II like mess kits that nobody uses, but because there's a contract to somebody's district in Texas, they still get made and they still get issued. I mean, I've got some of that stuff at home. The property accountability was so slipshod, certainly for people who were going over as individual augmentees, that nobody really knew who had what. And so I went through a replacement detachment in Georgia. Actually, I guess it was Fort Benning, where we went through some training for a period of about a week, and then we got all of our issue, and then got on a plane, and then went over to Saudi Arabia, and then we're doled out to where we were going to go. But this is the Kevlar helmet that I was issued to go to Saudi Arabia. And now that I think back on it, while the war was still gone, we would wear it to and from work. But in the building, you take all this stuff off. And then on a couple of occasions, when we went up to Kuwait City to go talk to some folks up there, I think maybe 2 trips to Kuwait and 1 out to the big military installation in Saudi Arabia, you dress up in all this stuff simply because you never know if there's somebody out there willing to take a shot. But when we're getting ready to come back after 6 months, and this is before you could email hand receipts around to know who would sign for what, and so you could save stuff onto a floppy disk, I guess, but everything had to be physically moved around, and so nobody knew really who had what. So
sounds like an opportunity.
Well, it was for me. That's how I ended up with this, because I thought, well, okay, if I got room, maybe I'll just like to hang on to some things.
Sure. So
I turned my weapon in. I had a .45 caliber pistol. Of course, I turned that in because I was going to mess around with trying to take a pistol. Didn't want to anyway. But lots of bits and pieces of the uniforms. So like this Kevlar, I just brought all the way back, and nobody asked me, why are you taking your Kevlar home? So because nobody knew. I mean, nobody was accountable for it, and so I brought this back. So this is the Kevlar I wore. And during Desert Storm, still got the old-fashioned cookie chocolate chip camouflage pattern,
which we were talking a little bit before the show that I don't think they're using that anymore.
No, they haven't used this since the early 90s, and this is sort of the original model of Kevlar helmet. So the whole design of this is obsolete now, so I mean, it wouldn't be of any use to anybody. So I brought this back.
And you brought something else.
I also brought this protective mask.
This is going back to your education. This is show and tell.
Because there was every expectation that Saddam was going to use chemical weapons against U.S. forces once the attack occurred. We all went expecting it was going to happen. I mean, he'd used it against the Kurds, and he'd used it against the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war, so why would he not unleash this stuff on us? And as it turns out, he didn't.
Do you want...
However, sure.
I just don't know if you want...
So,
here we go.
So anyway, this is an authentic late 80s, early 90s version of a protective mask to guard against chemical attack. It's got the whole thing. I got the atropine injectors, the pills, everything you would take if you got a whiff of nerve gas is all still in here. And brought this all the way home. Of course, this is obsolete too. Nobody could use this now. But we had to go through a lot of training to learn how to put these things on in 9 seconds and all this stuff. And so
Oh my
this
gosh.
this has not been out of the case in I can't tell you how many years. So you put this on your face and you clear it, and the filters in here, in theory, then take out any like mustard agent or nerve agent or anything like
And
that.
I'm assuming too, like if you wore glasses, this would be.
Well, yeah, the
you have
glasses
to-
got to go. However, the Army did issue some glass inserts. So what they would do is they take your prescription for
Oh
the
my
glass
goodness,
lenses,
okay.
and then you have to put them in here so that they had already been
As
inserted.
you're fighting the gas.
Yeah, but let me tell you, my inserts aren't in there because they were next to
So
impossible.
did you ever have
insert.
to wear this?
Not in anger, as I might say. Oh, in training, yeah, a lot.
Oh, in training, but I mean,
But yeah, we never. I don't recall ever having an alarm where we had to mask up. The couple of scuds that came in toward where I was during the actual war were taken care of by patriots, you know, before there was an immediate danger. So,
okay.
so no, but this along with our sidearms, were things we had to carry on us all the time. So I had a little pistol in my holster, and then I had this on the other hip. I'm sure there's some other goodies in here. Oh my gosh. Atropine injectors. God knows what kind of a fit you would go into if you jam one of these in your hand. So, but these were if you and this is the real stuff. It may not be active any longer.
I'm wondering.
but-
I was. Let me say this for just a second
Yeah.
because it has the.
but there are needles in this so that if you are a
See, okay, September '95. Expiration date '95. So it
Okay.
should be not any good anymore.
no, I would hope not. And then so you would
Nerve
you
agent.
would inject yourself, or somebody, or your pal who was maybe in better condition would inject you with these to counteract a chemical agent you might be
And you
subjected
just
to.
like stick it in your thigh or
Yeah.
something.
And then tablets for nerve agent pre-treatment tablets. So here you go, just for your medicine cabinet. So anyway, yeah, this is real stuff. Again, it's expired, but still,
you
you don't
keep-
want to jam this in your hand, I guess.
Do you want to put it back?
Oh
in
yeah, I
this
guess I
little
should do
thing?
that.
It goes back in this little.
Someday this will end up in a
That's what I was going to say.
antique
I know.
stores,
You
and
see
somebody's
every-
going to be messing around and then end up with an unpleasant surprise. So anyway, I brought this back along with other bits and pieces of uniforms and coats and things and other stuff that I could have turned in but hung on to, which are now in a duffel bag in my basement. But I do keep the helmet out on a shelf just because it's kind of a neat thing.
Sure. All right, so now we're at, I think, 91
Yeah.
or something.
So I came back in
Okay.
August of '91, and Felicia was still at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Went back there initially, went back to Fort Huachuca, checked in, and then I had orders for Germany. I've been wanting a tour in Germany, in Europe, badly ever since I came in the Army. It's one of my main goals, and so I left in October, right at the end of September of '91, and went to Germany. I was in northern Bavaria, near Nuremberg, a little place called Illesheim Army Airfield, which is still there. I just talked. There was a young man came in my wife's shop just this past weekend who just came back from Germany, and he was stationed at one of the little bases near us, Giebelstadt, and so he said Illesheim is still there. So I ended up there. It was an Army. It was an aviation brigade, an Army Aviation Brigade helicopters, Apaches, and I was the intelligence officer for the 11th Aviation Brigade.
Okay.
So I spent from the fall of '91 and then got housing, got everything set, and then in April of '92, the 11th of April, 1992, Felicia arrived and joined me there, and we were there for.
And she's in the Red Cross all this time as
Yeah.
well.
As a matter of fact, when she arrived, she worked for the Red Cross that whole tour there. She drove to a place called Aschaffenburg, which is 30 or 40 miles up the road. And I remember at the time thinking it was lunacy to drive 30 miles to go to work. Now I drive 60 miles to go to work, and I don't think anything of it. She went to Aschaffenburg, and then that closed down because this was a period of a big drawdown in Europe. When I got to Germany, there were about 300,000 U.S. service members of all services in Europe, and by the time I left in '98, it was down to about 60,000.
So this place where you were stationed, about how many were there? Or do you remember?
Well, probably maybe,
And was this all Army?
yes, it was all Army. It was Army Aviation Brigade. We had 3 squadrons.
So now were you up
cavalry.
in helicopter now?
No, I wasn't.
I know, but I thought maybe you were going to tell me that you had gone on and learned to
No,
fly
I did later
helicopter.
on, and I'll be happy to tell you all about
Okay.
that.
Okay.
But no, I was the intelligence officer, so my job was to work in the command post and advise the brigade commander and the subordinate battalion or squadron commanders about where armored vehicles might be, so that the Apaches could go and then pop up over a hill and shoot a Hellfire missile and blow up the tank. This is all still Soviet-oriented stuff, or Russian. The Soviet Union had just gone away, but we were still oriented toward that because we hadn't really got to the low-intensity conflict stuff. But I was the brigade intelligence officer for 18 months, and then I was the brigade headquarters company commander for the last 18 months. So we were there from 91 to 94. Then went to Wiesbaden Air Base, which is a suburb of Frankfurt. And I was assigned to a military intelligence brigade there. Initially I was the adjutant. And I'm still a captain at this point. I got promoted to captain just as I left Fort Irwin, California. Just like the last couple weeks in the spring of '90, I got promoted to captain. And usually in the Army, captain is where, if you're an officer, captain is where you sort of spend the most time. You can spend 6-7 years as a captain. I mean, that's sort of where you really kind of homestead in terms of rank. I was an adjutant at battalion level and brigade level at Wiesbaden Air Base, which is just, again, it's a beautiful city, right on the Main River, right across the river from Mainz.
I'm just thinking of this young man from North Carolina who wanted to see so much, and look at all you've seen. Okay.
Well, actually, and I took full use of the opportunities because when
Sure.
not to backtrack too much, but when I was, the 4 years I spent in California, and of course I was single during those 4 years, even though I knew Felicia, but we spent most of that time living several hundred miles apart. She was at Fort Ord, and I was at Fort Irwin, and so we were 300 miles apart most of the time. But I periodically, I would take a week or 10 days leave 2 or 3 times a year, and I would get in my car or pickup truck. I didn't have a credit card. I would get $500 or $600 in cash and stick it in my pocket, and I would just head out. And I would sort of say, okay, I'm going to go see the Great Plains, or I'm going to go see the Southwest, or I'm going to go up the Pacific Coast or wherever. And I would just sort of say, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here, and I would just drive. And not another soul in the world would know where I was at from day to day. And it was just fabulous. But when we got to Europe, we did the same kinds of things over there. We did a lot of travel, a lot of driving. And Europe, or Germany, is ideal for kind of driving around Europe, because Europe's very compact. Driving from Germany to France is like driving from Virginia
But totally
to North
different.
Carolina.
Yeah, I years ago did traveling in Europe.
But
so
you
different.
But you can cover a lot of ground, lots of different countries and cultures, pretty quickly. I'm trying to think of where I was before I took that detour.
Well, but you were in
Wiesbaden.
Germany.
Yeah,
you were in
Wiesbaden Air
Wiesbaden
Base.
Air Base.
So while I was at the 205th MI Brigade, and again, it's another opportunity that sort of came along that I sort of went along with. But my brigade commander called me in one day, and he says, the deputy corps commander is looking for a new aide, and I want you to go down and interview right now. My driver will take you down. This was in Heidelberg, about an hour's drive away. And I said, well, okay. I thought, well, that might be kind of neat, but it's nothing I'd ever thought about doing. But the brigade commander kind of liked me. And I remember saying, he asked me what kinds of things I had experience in, and I said, I don't really know much about that sort of thing. And he says, yeah, he told me one thing I've always remembered, actually. It's good advice. He said, that doesn't matter. He says, you think logically, and if you can think logically, you can do any job, because you can reason your way through it. And I've always thought that, and it's true, actually. If you're analytical, you can do anything. You can just sort of work it out. So I went down, interviewed for the deputy corps commanders. I was a 2-star general to be his aide-de-camp, and I got that. So after about a year in Wiesbaden, then we moved down to Heidelberg and spent the last 3 years in Germany there, which was fabulous. A beautiful city. And so going back to helicopters, as the aide to the deputy corps commander, he had a dedicated Black Hawk and Black Hawk crew, because one of his jobs was to go out and visit all the subordinate commands and go to meetings and things like that. And so most days we were in the helicopter, we were in the Black Hawk going someplace. And so we went all over Germany, all the different bases, and occasionally we would take it even further. Like I know we went to the Netherlands once, and we used the Black Hawk. One thing about a Black Hawk, I mean, it's more like it's like an airplane with a rotary wing on top. I mean, it moves very quickly and it's very noisy. But if you're in a Black Hawk too long, it begins just to beat you up because it's it takes a toll on you. So if we had to go really like a long way, we would take I would get like a fixed wing aircraft, like a little prop plane or even a little Army Learjet. But we were in the helicopter like almost every day. So did that for about another 18 months actually.
Okay.
And then I finished up my tour in Germany with 18 months at the Corps G2. The G2 is the intelligence office, the intelligence section at Corps level. And so I was there for the last 18 months. We finally left there in 1998.
And then came stateside.
Yeah, I'll tell you an interesting story during when I was in the E2, if you got
Sure.
just a second.
No, we're good.
You remember Hillary Clinton had talked about the trip that she made to Bosnia and landing under sniper
Yes,
fire and all that.
yes.
Well, she stopped and saw us on her way there. So this is March of 1996.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we had just deployed one of the divisions of 5th Corps to Bosnia to serve as the American element of the peacekeeping force there in the Balkans. And so my boss, as the deputy corps commander, was responsible for all the non-deploying elements. So he was sort of the rear commanding general. First Lady Clinton, along with an entourage that consisted of Chelsea and Sheryl Crow the singer and Sinbad the comedian,
Okay.
they were coming through, and they were going to stop at the base where the deploying soldiers had lived to talk to their family members, and then they were going to go on down to Bosnia to visit the troops down there. So my boss was in charge of all the arrangements, and so I helped him make the arrangements, and so the White House advance crew came over. But anyway, the First Lady and Chelsea arrived on a Sunday, and they met all the family members and the soldiers who didn't go, and they had like a nice thing in the mess hall there. There was this little concern out in the middle of the German woods. I think it was Bad Kreuznach, if I recall. And Sheryl Crow, who was there by herself, and she was carrying a guitar case around, and she just got the guitar case out, and she just stood there in the mess hall and just sung for everybody. No amplification, no mics, and she did very well. She sounded great. And then we went over to an elementary school where a little program was being prepared for the First Lady. And they had a group of kids, and there was some lady who was in charge of the family group who sort of introduced everything. They brought the First Lady and Chelsea, and they sat them in these chairs. They're sort of like undersized chairs, almost kind of comical, because they're like almost like little kid chairs. And they said, "You sit here," and the girls are singing. When the singing stopped, nobody came forward to say, okay, this is what's going to happen next. And so it's like it was apparent that at that moment, nobody was really in charge. And so I'm thinking, okay, so what's going to happen here? But Mrs. Clinton sort of realized that, things were at sort of a loose end. She reached over and she picked up the microphone that the other lady had laid there and just started talking. And she started talking about the importance of families and all those kinds of themes. But I remember thinking at the time, boy, that's pretty slick, because she just took charge of it and basically was talking off the top of her head. And after about 5 minutes of that, the door in the back blows open, and in comes Sinbad, who'd missed his flight. He walked straight up on the stage and just started being funny, and it was a very nice afternoon. So that was. But anyway, they got on the plane from there and flew down to Bosnia, and that's when the whole sniper fire thing that she had talked about occurred. So.
Wow.
Your little glimpse behind the curtain.
The little behind the scenes. Okay, so then after that, you're back stateside? And
we came, I got picked up to go to an Army school, Army Command and General Staff College, which is a one-year course at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So we came back to Fort Leavenworth in June of 1998, and were there until June of 1999. It was a great year. I mean, the school was good, but not terribly arduous. So you had enough time to do other things and to do a lot of sightseeing and stuff. So anyway, I wanted to go to Korea, and so when they came around to ask where people wanted to go, I I volunteered to go on a 2-year company tour to Korea. And so in summer, so then in '99, we went to Korea. I was in Seoul for 2 years.
Wow.
And that was great.
Yeah, our son, he spent time in Korea. He loved it.
Yeah.
That was always interesting when he got stationed over in Korea. That's actually where he met his future bride.
Yeah.
But anyway, okay.
So we lived off base in a tiny little apartment in a Korean neighborhood on a hill that was just horrible. I mean, you couldn't drive up in that. I mean, it was basically alleyways with these little buildings packed on top of each other. And so it was just physically exhausting to live there because of how hard it was just to get around. I bought a little Daewoo, used Daewoo for $300. I didn't ship I had a pickup truck which I didn't ship. I left it with Felicia's son in Colorado, but I did buy a little used car. It was just beat to death. But it was such a problem. Driving in Seoul, driving in Korea in general, but certainly in the cities, was just absolutely ungodly. I mean, it was just impossible to get around. They just drive you crazy. So,
And what were your responsibilities when you were in Korea?
well, I was at another military intelligence brigade,
Okay.
501st, whose mission it was to provide theater level intel support to 8th U.S. Army, which was the Army component of the joint U.S. forces and the UN forces, I guess, for that matter. So we had like a signals intelligence battalion, and we had like a human intelligence battalion, and we had like an operations battalion which was full of analysts. And so we kind of had the whole package of intel support that we provided to the 8th Army commander, who had under him most of the ground forces that would have fought in any war that would have occurred if had the North Koreans spilled over. That was a very fast-paced year because you tended to work a lot, and the days were very long, and you rarely took 2 days off on the weekend. But Seoul was just a fascinating place to be. I mean, of course, it's like in Europe. Even if you don't know the language, you can figure things out. You can figure out what a street sign kind of says because of the basic similarities between English and the other European languages. But in Korea, except in some places where they had like English translations along with the written Korean language, you couldn't figure out anything. So it was really, an alien kind of environment. But just really fascinating. I mean, I would sometimes if I had time on a Saturday, I would take a bus or take the subway. Seoul apparently had really been transformed in the late 80s because they hosted the Olympics in 1988.
Sure.
And so the subway system, which is really second to none, was built then. And a lot of the things that they put in to accommodate non-Korean tourists, like certain signs in English, were installed at that time. But I would take the subway or a bus to somewhere way out in Seoul where I'd not been, then I would just walk back. And it might take me 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, it would take me 2 or 3 hours to walk back. And you'd go through all these little neighborhoods and these little markets, and it was just fascinating. And in fact, I would have stayed longer.
So you were there, what, a year?
2.
2 years.
And Felicia was there too. We occupied an apartment that was probably the size of this room, of this space here. I mean, we had bedroom here, bedroom there, kitchen. I mean, we were just packed in. She had a great job there, though. There was a gift shop. In fact, it was a really big deal gift shop called the Chosen Gift Shop, which was run by the Officers' Wives Club, because employment opportunities for spouses of service members were very limited. So the officers' wives had established this at some point in the past, and so they worked there as volunteers. And so Felicia became a buyer for them. And so Korea was a great place for, we visited China and Hong Kong and Tokyo, but she went on her own with buying trips like to Thailand a couple of times and some other places that I never had a chance to go. And so half the stuff in our house is from the Chosen Gift Shop in Korea. We have a lot of stuff that we still have sitting around the house from there. But we left Korea in 2001.
Okay.
And I mean, I had a great time, and it was hard, but I never really considered it a hardship assignment. I mean, I could have been on the DMZ up there, patrolling every day, and I wasn't. But because it's treated as a hardship assignment, you can kind of get your pick after Korea of where you want to go.
Okay, so now we're at 2001.
Yeah.
So
I had always wanted to do a tour in the UK. I visited Great Britain once when we were in Germany. Actually, twice. I did a 4-day trip to London in '94, and went back in '97, and did about 10 day, maybe a week of just driving around in my pickup truck. Took the ferry over from Calais, France, and just drove all the way up to Scotland and back down. In both those cases, Felicia didn't go because I think the 4-day trip to London, she couldn't get away from work, and when I did the next swing, she was in the States on an extended visit, so I did it while she was away. So anyway, I'd always wanted to go back there to live, and so I got that. So we went to the UK in June or July of 2001, and were there until 2003. And we were there when 9/11 occurred, as a matter of fact.
Oh, so that's where you were. You were over there.
Actually, I happened to be at Fort Huachuca on 9/11. I went back to a worldwide Army Intel conference that Fort Huachuca
And I wanted to catch up too now. Are you still rank of captain, or has that changed?
Boy, I'm remiss. I got promoted to major right before I left Germany in '98. I'm glad I forgot to mention that, but I got promoted to major in '98 just before I left Germany. So I was a major in Korea and at Fort Leavenworth, and through most of the time in the UK. So I was assigned, I was the Army Exchange Officer at a UK base at a place called Chicksands, about 50 miles north of London. It had been a U.S. Air Force base. It had been RAF Chicksands from the end of the Second World War until the mid-90s, and it was a signals intelligence. It was a listening post for both the Brits during World War II and then for the U.S. Air Force after World War II. And then when it's turned back over to the Brits in '96, the British made it to an intelligence school, and so they taught various aspects of the military intelligence trade. They had like a tactical intelligence school, and I was a part of that. They had like a signals intelligence school. They had a human intelligence school. They had all that stuff. So I was in charge of a section. Myself and three British warrant officers ran a course, actually a couple of different courses, but we trained junior British Army officers how to conduct tactical intelligence, like if you're at, say, the battalion level. And that was actually a lot of fun doing that. And because the Brits don't believe in working hard unless there's a reason to do so, they didn't work me too hard either. So in fact, they thought I was an overachiever. But even with overachieving by their standards, it left time to do a lot of traveling around the UK. And of course, we were close enough. We could drive 6 miles to Hitchin and get on the train and go to London for the evening for a show or a concert, and then still be back home by 12:30 at night. So it was ideal. But it was rural. It was a rural area, villages and farmland and sheep and the whole British scene that you think about. And so, but concerning 9/11, I had come back to Fort Huachuca for an Army intelligence conference that started on Monday, the 10th of September, and I'd arrived the weekend before. And that was the first time I've been back to Huachuca since having left there in, I guess, 1990 when I did my training there. So I was driving around and seeing places I'd visited before, and then of course 9/11 happened it was Tuesday morning, and the school very quickly, the conference very quickly got suspended, and so basically everybody who was sort of stuck there kind of just hung out, and because they implemented additional security measures there at Fort Huachuca, getting on the base with all the checks with vehicles and things was took forever, and so I was lucky because the commercial airline flights in the United States were suspended for several days, and the flight I had booked back to the UK was for Saturday. Well, Saturday was the day that the flights were to resume, and so, like the day before, I started trying to call the airline, thinking I was going to get bumped into the following week. But after being on hold for a couple hours, a lady got on the phone and she says, "Well, no, because you have a flight booked tomorrow, and we're starting back tomorrow. Your reservation's still good." So I got out, and I got back to Britain on Sunday, only about 5 hours after my scheduled arrival time. So the return trip ended up being kind of worked out well for me. But I got to tell you, the Brits were so supportive, and there were only 2 U.S. families on this base. There was Felicia and myself, and there was a U.S. Air Force captain, his wife, and they had a couple of kids. He was an instructor at one of the schools too. So we're the only Americans on the place. But the British force, they couldn't have been nicer. My chain of command was actually at the U.S. Embassy in London. That's where my actual boss was, and all the exchange officers were doled out in the countryside. But they were very, very nice. I was also in the UK during the build-up, and during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Okay. Not quite as happy a time in terms of living amongst the Brits, because they were fiercely opposed. All the British military folks that I worked with, they knew that if the United States went into Iraq, that Tony Blair was going to drag them into it too, and they didn't want to go. And they made no secret of the fact that they didn't want to go. So I got an earful of that stuff every day. You know, in late 2002, early 2003, they just thought it was the stupidest thing going, and they absolutely opposed to it, and were just furious that their government was going to,
follow suit.
Play the little brother to the U.S. and go into Iraq. So, but we left there in summer 2003, and that's how we ended up in Virginia.
Okay.
So at that point, I got promoted to lieutenant colonel.
That's what I knew, because I knew you were lieutenant colonel.
I got promoted to a lieutenant colonel in January 2003, just 6 months or so before we left. So when I got here, it's what I was, and I had never set foot in the Pentagon. And I was sort of at the point in my career where service at staff at about those levels was sort of going to be expected. And to be honest, I mean, I'd visited D.C. a couple times in my life, and so it was in sort of a new frontier, and so I didn't mind. So I was on the Army staff, worked in the Army Operations Center from middle of 2003 through 2004, and I was sort of in charge of the Army G2 Watch, the Army Intelligence Watch, and we put together briefings for the Army Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice Chief, and the Army leadership levels who we sort of catered to. They were our customers. Toward the end of 2004, from the invasion of Iraq through 2003, there'd been like whole units were being rotated over and back. And when it looked like it was going to be a long-term commitment, the Army began to look at sending individual replacements, not unlike the situation in Saudi Arabia a number of years before, where they had units over, but then they started sending individuals. So anyway, I volunteered to go to Iraq, and it was going to go from limited sort of unit rotations over for a few months to being 1 year individual tours. So I volunteered to go over for a year, and only found, I put my name on the list, and I told Felicia, I said, if the opportunity ever comes, I'm a volunteer to go. And we found out with about, with less than a month's notice. And we were on the Dern House tour over here at Christmas time too, so we had to get rid of the house tour. And then I left on the 2nd of January 2005 to go to Fort Benning, process, and then went to Iraq. And I was in Baghdad for a year.
And again, doing intelligence sort of things over there?
Yes, and again at
this
the
point
you're
a lieutenant colonel now when you're over there. Okay.
Yeah. So my job that year was I was in charge. I was the night shift guy in charge at the intelligence center that provided theater level intelligence support for the entire multinational force Iraq, MNFI. General George Casey was the commander. He was the MNFI commander for 2.5 years actually. He was replaced by Petraeus when the surge first came in. General Casey, I'd worked with him in Germany actually, knew him as a colonel at 5th Corps, a great guy. But he and other leadership at the time saw strategy in Iraq as being different than where the Bush administration was beginning to go at the time, which is what we're doing is not working, we've got to do something else. And so General Petraeus was brought in to implement the surge, which then sort of turn things around for us. But I was in charge of a group of folks. We put together the intelligence portion of the morning briefings that General Casey got at 7 or 7:30, I can't remember. And then also I had to do like the final edits and all the written products and things like that we did. And I also ended up being the morning briefer for General Casey, which I did 266 times.
Really, Keith, this is a stellar military. I mean,
well, if you stay in for 24 years, you end up doing lots of different things.
Exactly.
Which is one of the nice things
so
about
you were
it.
there in Iraq for what, about a year?
That tour a year. I went back for a 4-month tour in 2007, but that was It was a year. Actually, it was. I left here on the 2nd of January 2005, and I arrived back here with all said and done on the 1st of February 2006. Now I did have R&R in August of 2005, where I came back for a couple weeks. That was a part of the whole deal. You got to come back for a couple weeks in R&R, so I came back and painted the garage. I was on R&R, so came back for those couple weeks. Other than that, I was gone for 13 months, I guess. But it was great. But that was a fast pace, because I was working. I mean, because I was in charge of a certain element. You know, I mean, I was working 15, 16 hours a day, and it was a 7 days a week. It never stopped. But
and where were you? I mean, were you physically close to where combat was going on, or anything? Or again, are you?
Well, in a sense, yeah, because we were out by the Baghdad airport, called BIAP, Baghdad International Airport. And I worked in a building called the Perfume Palace. And there were a number of sub-camps linked together in a larger secure area, referred to as Baghdad, blah, 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 some folks. But you had the airport, which is basically a military airport at that point. I guess it's now back to being a civilian airport. We had Camp Slayer, which is I worked on, which is where I did my daily work. But in the mornings, we'd drive over to the Al-Fal Palace, which is one of Saddam's palaces. And all the buildings where we operated out of were old Saddam regime palaces and villas and all kinds of just fanciful, you know, architecture. I mean, just really ornate stuff. And we'd go over to the Al-Fal Palace, which is where General Casey's headquarters was. And then there was a large sort of amphitheater set up in there. And then we would do the briefings, and so I did the intel portion, other people did other portions, but all the headquarters in the Baghdad area were piped into that. So the other headquarters elements in Baghdad would see on the screen and then hear our voices as we briefed the various stuff. So that was really a long slog. And to be honest, there's a lot about military life that's just slogging along, because unless you're doing something really exciting or getting shot at or something like that, a lot of it's just very routine. And Desert Storm, once things calm down, you fall into a routine. And with Iraq, by 2005, things had settled down. Our big push in 2005 were the Iraqi elections. Initially, there was a referendum on a new constitution, and then there were 2 rounds of elections later in the year to elect a government. And so the big push was to improve security to the point where people would feel safe enough to go out to vote, and also just establish the mechanism for democracy, which didn't exist until that time. So that was what the big push was in 2005. And so when I left, we just had the second round of elections. So you had a prime minister and you had a cabinet and all that stuff that was just setting up. But in terms of being close to combat, to go outside the walls at all was put your life at risk.
Sure.
So if you walked outside as an American or as a non-Iraqi, I mean, you were basically in combat at that point, because you didn't know what was going to happen to you. So so any place outside of a secure base was pretty much the front lines, like as Vietnam became, I guess, at certain points. But came back from Iraq in early 2006. And then I went to work for the National Security Agency at the Pentagon. Went back to the Pentagon, but no longer on the Army staff. But the National Security Agency, NSA, responsible for the country's signals intelligence and intercepts and things. They have a pretty robust presence at the Pentagon, and so I went to work for them. And in that job, our office we made sure, like Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Army Chief of Staff and those guys, and all the policymakers on the DoD staff were getting signals intelligence reports that would support policymaking. So it was at sort of a high-level thing like that. The best thing out of that whole tour, which was like the last couple years, I guess I was in, was I did another tour to deployment to Iraq. There was an intelligence office at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, in downtown Baghdad. I'd been out by the Baghdad airport, and I was there before, but this was downtown. In the old Republican Palace, which had been one of the buildings that he operated out of. And this was actually an older building, probably built in the 60s, before all the really grand, fancy stuff got built by the regime. But I went back there and I was the deputy chief of that office for 4 months. Would love to have stayed longer there because that was, it came right at the end of my career because when I got back from that, I basically just retired. And I'd already set the groundwork in motion.
So when you
before I
retired,
went.
so we're talking, I think you said 24 years.
Yeah. Well, my retirement date is the 1st of April, 2008. I signed out on terminal leave. So actually, I stopped working right at the end of 2007. And I got back from that last tour in Iraq in September 2007. But in that job, because we had elements out at all these bases around Iraq, part of my job was to go out and visit all these folks, and it was fabulous because I could go down to the airfield and I would book a flight on usually a helicopter like a Black Hawk, sometimes a fixed wing airplane, and would fly to this base or that base and stay a day or so and see what our elements like it. So, but we flying over lots of Iraqi towns and so saw a lot of the country from the air like that. A couple runs up and down the road from between Baghdad Airport and the embassy, which is
Well, you know what I
very
wanted
experienced.
to do now that you're back, I wanted to touch a little bit because I know since you've been in Culpeper, you've been in, I mean, you've stayed involved in activities. I know you were very instrumental in getting the statue down at Wine Memorial Park, and you now head up the VFW. So you may have retired, but you're still got your hands involved.
Well, thank you for noticing that. Well, when I retired, and again, I went in the Army late, so when I retired, I mean, I was already...
I'm trying to figure when you retired, you must be in your 40s or...
Well, I retired when I was almost 52.
Okay.
So, I mean, I was already getting to be an older guy.
Well,
Yeah.
not anymore. Come on.
Present company accepting. But I was at the point where I thought, okay, so what's an appropriate role for me now? What should I do? And I'd always, been in the military career. It's difficult to get involved in a local civilian community and things of that nature. But when we got here, we bought the house here in 2004. I should backtrack and go into that. But we lived in Alexandria for a year and rented a townhouse. And because I knew my retirement from the Army was going to be coming up in the next few years, and we'd always wanted to find an old house in an old established neighborhood within walking distance of a quaint downtown, and we just began to look on the weekends.
Well, and I know
Warrenton
for a
in
fact
here.
you have that. So I mean,
Yeah.
Beautiful
So
home.
that's how we ended up here, and that's how we bought our house out there. So we rented the townhouse in Alexandria for a year once we got back from the UK, and then we moved out here. But once I retired from the Army, well, it's a huge transition. It's as big a transition as going into the Army, which was gut wrenching at the time. But getting out was okay. So now what do I do? What's a guy of my age and where I've been, and I mean, what should I do now? What's the right kind of thing for me to do? So I thought, well, I'll see if I can get involved in the local community and do things. I always thought that was a good thing for people to do, and it was something that folks should aspire to. But in the military career, you really can't do it, and you live your life in 2 and 3 year snippets: 2 years here, 2 years here, 2 years here, and you can get involved in those military communities while you're there. But it's a very quick thing. It's all very transient. People come and go, and but I was invited to join the VFW post here by a couple of guys who were in it at the time who had seen a thing in the newspaper about me coming back from Iraq. And I thought, okay, maybe that would be a good vehicle. So went out there and joined up. And while I was a member of that, and right about the time I was retiring from the Army, the town began to look for volunteers to run this monument committee. Veterans Recognition
see,
Committee
because
was called.
I'm trying to remember because I took on the editorship of the paper in November of '08, and I'm just remembering that it was somewhere in there because I mean I remember we covered that, and I remember when the sculptor came out, and just, I mean anyway how involved you were with that whole effort.
Yeah, well, that group was the committee was formed in I think June of 2008 because somebody from the town had contacted the VFW post and were soliciting for volunteers to be on the committee, and so I put my name in and got on the committee. Went to the first meeting, and then there were I guess maybe 8 or 9 of us, and we had a meeting with the town planning staff, and ended up being the chairman of the committee.
I remember that. I remember that.
And you know why I was the chairman of the committee? Because when we had the meeting, we had to try to figure out who's going to be in charge. One of the other people says, "You talk the most, so why don't you be the chairman?" Which is
that's what I
still
remember.
talk too
No,
much.
I'm just remembering when I covered that. Yes, you were the chairman of that, and it's a wonderful asset to the.
Well,
to
thank
the
you very
area.
much.
Absolutely, the homage.
You know, actually, a lot of things sort of came into place for that, and that cost us $125,000 altogether. Not a penny of taxpayers' money,
Right, I
except for
remember
the
that.
indirect support the town provided by using the public works guys to prepare the footer and just provide the grounds around in the park. But the town didn't kick in any cash. We didn't have to ask the town for any cash whatsoever. But we were lucky because of my affiliation with the VFW, I was able to work the VFW's contributions of about $40,000, which was about a third of it. We had one other supporter of the project who, when we started, had already donated about $38,000 or $39,000, and then we had to do other things just to raise the money that was left. So really, our fundraising challenge was about $40,000, which we managed to get through selling the bricks down there and little fundraisers that we had here and there. But we did all that in 3 years.
Right, and it just as a reminder to our viewers, those that are watching us here today, that memorial was to honor Culpeper servicemen from World War II in Korea.
Ones who were killed on on duty in World War II in Korea, and
I
so
think there's about 60 names or more on there.
you know what, I can't remember. I was thinking it was 40 something, and we just added George Franklin.
Right, I
Jenkins.
remember that. We just added another name.
So there's only a couple from Korea, and the bulk or
The
the
bulk
rest
will-
are the.
We're looking-
But yeah, a lot of things came together to make that possible. Like getting in contact with the sculptor, who's since passed away,
yes,
Jim Brothers.
Jim Brothers has passed away.
But just happened to had to get in contact with a guy who had worked with him on the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, who said that Jim might have something that he was already working on that would suit our purposes, and it did perfectly.
Oh, it was beautiful.
So
I remember
things just
talking
fell
to
into
him.
place on that.
So you did. I know you did that. I know you've done VFW, and of course now you're on town council. So you're keeping busy.
Well, I have been, but I figure, I'm 60 years old now, so I figure another 4 or 5 years, now it's going to be time to start giving some stuff up. But I think, and Felicia's business downtown. One of the
Yes.
things we'd always want to kind of run a business. Now that's her business, and she runs it, and she's got the bulk of the responsibility and does the bulk of the work. But I'm closely enough affiliated. It's checking the block off my list too. So.
And again, for our viewers, it's La Vida Loca.
La Vida Loca,
All
yes.
things bees,
on,
be happy.
200 block of East Davis Street. So, yeah, but she's done very well with it. I'm very proud of her with how that's all come together.
One other question I wanted to ask you too, throughout your really long and storied military career, what about camaraderie or friends that you made where during that time you still keep in contact with any of them?
Well, some actually. There's a young man who was my executive officer when I was a company commander in Germany in the early 90s, who's now a full bird colonel, and he's the army attaché in Budapest, Hungary. And he and his wife and several of their kids came down to visit just in the last few months. So we always kind of keep in contact with him. Don't necessarily see them very often. And the guy who was my first sergeant when I was a company commander, keep in contact with him and his wife, and we see them every few years. They are now truckers. He retired from the Army. They bought a big trucking rig, and so now they drive around the country, and they're an independent trucker. That's what he does. And he has a house in Tennessee someplace where he stops every month or so to relax for a few days, and they're back out on the road again.
Well, as we look to, as we're going along with this, tapping back into your education a little bit, if you had a room full of young high school students or young students, what would be your message about serving in the military or feelings about military?
Well, a 20 or 24-year career is not for everybody, but an enlistment in the armed forces will benefit any young person, and I firmly believe that. It'll get you out of the house. It'll expose you to new people, new things, new places. It will make you self-sufficient because I mean, you get paid enough to live off of unless you just irresponsible.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I mean, our son, well, he was in for, well, husband served in Vietnam, but son in for 5 years, and now actually just had his second, they had their second child just yesterday. But anyway, I was talking to him this morning, and he was telling me that he was going to encourage his children to do some military only because of the perspective it gave him. And again, he's 29 now, so.
Oh, really?
Yes, interesting.
Yeah,
So-
but it will benefit anybody. You know, you can go in and do. I don't know what the tours are these days. Used to be you could go in for just a couple of years, but because most, at least a lot of jobs now require some little bit of technical training. So
Yes,
maybe 3 or 4 years. I know the Navy has some that are even 6-year enlistments for highly technical jobs. But to go in for a few years, especially if you're young and you don't really know what to do, you can make a decent living, and you can see some things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, and you're not laying around the house, and you know it would just do anybody good. And you can put back money for college. You can take classes while you're in. It can just open up a whole world of opportunities for people. And it certainly did for me. Smartest thing I ever did. And I'm telling you, I rolled the dice. It was it was a last resort for me. And I thought,
Well, it seems like it worked out very well.
oh, it did. It did. So anyway, I would encourage anybody unless somebody's anybody who doesn't already have a firm plan with where they want to go, like I'm going to do this, I'm going to go to medical school, you know, those kinds of things. But if you're sort of, you know, kind of at loose ends, I would say look at it.
All righty. Very good. Well, do you have anything else to add? I think we've covered quite a bit.
Yes, we did. I'm sure I babbled far too long, so and my apologies for that. But when you're in for 24 years, you know, you do a lot of different things, and you go to a lot of different places, you know, 2-year snippets and 3-year snippets and things like that here and there. So it's a lot to cram in, actually, when you start to talk about it, you know. And so, you know, it's joining the Army was it was the greatest thing I ever did. And I mentioned earlier that my parents were just flabbergasted.
I know, that's
by
what
it.
you said.
But they became very proud later on, you know.
Sure, of
So,
course.
you know, because I became an officer, and like, you know, I worked in an office, and nobody from our family ever worked in an office. We always worked in plants and factories and farms. You know, we didn't have highfalutin stuff. You know, so and I was able to bring my parents overseas a couple times because, you know, they never went around. So I brought them over to Germany for 2 weeks in '92 and over to the UK for 2 weeks in 2002. It's the only time they ever went outside the United States. So I was able to do that for them. So,
Alrighty.
So anyway, no, but thank you very much. I thank you, John, for the opportunity.
Well, you're very welcome.
To do this.
You're
It was a
very
lot of fun.
welcome. This was great. Very enjoyable. It was. Don't worry about talking too much. This is all history making. To our viewers out there, thank you for joining us, and look forward to more of History of Our Heroes on Culpeper Media Network. Again, this is Anita Sherman, and thank you for spending time with us. And thank you, Keith.
Oh, thanks.